в значительной степени.
Конечно же, Российская Федерация не могла остаться безучастной к прямым обращениям глав ваших государств об оказании военной помощи перед лицом агрессора. В соответствии с нашими союзническими обязательствами президент Путин принял решение о проведении специальной военной операции по демилитаризации и денацификации Украины с тем, чтобы, освободившись от этого гнета, украинцы сами свободно могли бы определить свое будущее.
It's hogwash. It is reality detached.
In place of the defiant speeches, the somber strains of Beethoven now ring out over Independence Square. This revolution is moving into a new phase. The flowers and the children's tributes, flashes of something more sinister. Groups of armed men strut through the square with dubious iconography. That yellow armband is a 𝗲𝗁𝗪𝗿, a German symbol used by several SS divisions during the Second World War. Far-right graffiti is appearing, daubed on the walls of the city. The people who brought down the government were overwhelmingly ordinary Ukrainians, students and doctors, workers and even families, people who simply refused to back down. But the most organised and perhaps the most effective were a small number of far-right groups. When it came to confrontations with the police, it was often the nationalists who were the loudest and the most violent. A group calling itself the Right Sector is perhaps the largest. Its members can be seen marching around Kiev in columns of about a dozen. Mostly they carry baseball bats. Sometimes they carry guns. We met these men posing for pictures outside the burnt-out remains of what was once their headquarters. I asked them about their political beliefs.
Национал-социалистская тематика иногда в некоторых людях она есть проступает, как бы, ну, чтобы была единая нация. Но не у всех это не заложено в основе этой организации, это у некоторых людей есть.
А у вас?
У меня лично есть.
В смысле? Объясните.
Ну, мне как бы нравится эта идея единой нации. Я хочу, чтобы нация была единая, чтобы один народ, одна страна, одна нация.
А это подразумевается что?
Ну, как бы, чтобы чистая нация. Ну, не то, что там, как бы у Гитлера как было, но в своем роде немножко, ну, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация.
What about the East, I asked? What about Crimea, where many Ukrainians feel close historical ties to Russia?
Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Украина только для украинцев.
Police have largely disappeared from the streets of Kiev. Law and order is maintained by so-called self-defense groups. Not all hold extreme views, but those who do are often shy of the cameras. We got a late-night phone call from another group known as C14, inviting us to meet their leader at their new base. It turned out to be the former headquarters of the Communist Party, now occupied by the far right.
because we don't know. It's our general mission to totally ruin chains that connect our country with the imperial power from the past.
And that being Russia?
Yes, and Russia, not only Russia, Soviet Union.
Are you a Nazi?
No, I don't think I'm a Nazi, I'm a Ukrainian nationalist.
What does that mean?
The main confrontation is about that some ethnic groups have control many business structures, some economic, some political forces, and
which ethnic groups?
Russians and Jews and the Poles. It may be some non-Ukrainian group control a huge percent of some economic or political power. And of course, in this situation, Ukrainian people have some tension between it, and it causes conflicts.
Mr. 𝗏𝗏 says his group consists of around 200 men. C14 is affiliated with a political party called Svoboda, or Freedom, which now controls 4 ministries in the new government, including the Ministry of Defence. 2 of its MPs were recently photographed brandishing well-known far-right numerology. 88 stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet, 𝗏𝗫, Heil Hitler. The fervour of the revolution is beginning to fade now. People are starting to move on. But it's clear that it was the radical groups who kept up the pressure on Viktor Yanukovych, and many of them feel that this really is their victory. The question is, how much power will that give the far right in the new Ukraine? With their anti-Russian rhetoric, events in Crimea will almost certainly play into the hands of the nationalists. No one knows exactly how strong they are in terms of numbers, but the influence of the far right in Ukraine is growing. The protesters are back, but in place of ordinary citizens, now they're battle-hardened fighters. They're the same slogans as last year. Ukraine above all else. Glory, glory, glory. But in the mouths of the right sector, they take on a more sinister aspect. Well, there can be few more poignant depictions of how unfinished Ukraine's revolution is than this sight. All of these people bearing the banners of the far-right group, these people who helped overthrow Ukraine's pro-Russian president a year and a half ago. And they've been telling me that they want to bring down this president as well. Glory to Ukraine, they shout. The banner of the right sector harks back to a Ukrainian nationalist movement from the 1940s. They say the colours represent the blood of Ukrainians spilt upon their country's black soil. Their critics call them fascists and neo-Nazis. The revolution, which is known here as Maidan, overthrew the government and then set this country hurtling towards war. Just as it did during Maidan, the right sector has played a key role in the fighting in the east. Its members are more motivated than Ukraine's conscripted regular army, and the government relies on them to bolster their strength. Now they're flexing their muscles. In recent weeks, the right sector has been involved in firefights with Ukrainian security forces in the west of the country, hundreds of miles from the front line. These clashes in Mukachevo, on the border with the European Union, were about control of lucrative smuggling routes, but it was also a show of force, a signal from a strong militia to a weak government. Don't cross us. The platoon commander is a 19-year-old arts student. He talks about fighting enemies both external and internal. He and his men say the Ukrainian president is a traitor for signing the Minsk peace accords, which call for negotiations over the status of the breakaway regions.
Ні, президент ніхто. Він для нас ніхто.
Почему?
Ну, тому що ми його не вибирали. Ми стояли на Майдані не для того, щоб він зараз обирав особливий статус для Донецька. Ми, хлопці, помирали не для того, щоб зараз землі здавалися. Ну, він був ізбран бабульками старими, які ще таке думають, що він цар і Бог. Ну, він ніхто, він просто зливає Україну. Я думаю, що з часом буде третій Майдан. І... Ну, він же буде з автоматами. Перевіряємо, чи автомат, чи патронів не залишилося.
Все это правильно, должна быть украинская держава независимая и нормальная, европейская. Я, например, мне 46 лет уже, да, я родился, вырос еще в Советском Союзе. Я помню то все. И я вам скажу, что я воюю против совка. У меня маленькая дочь, 2 годика, и я не хочу, чтобы она жила при совке, понимаете?
They say most of their weapons are either recovered from the battlefield or donated by volunteers. They'll not bring them to the rally in Kiev, the commander told me. They don't need to.
В принципе, я знаю, что даже начальник генерального штаба и все сбройные силы, там, за исключением нескольких генералов, может быть, в Генштабе, в принципе, они нас поддерживают. Против нас никогда армия не пойдет.
The right sector took less than 2% in parliamentary elections last year, but their popularity is growing.
Слава Україні!
And not just among hardcore supporters. Listen to these two middle-aged ladies, ordinary residents of Kiev.
Как-то, понимаете, никаких изменений не происходит, ни лучше не становится. Но я уже не говорю о том, что в первую очередь хотят все, чтобы закончилась, конечно, война. Ну и потом же коррупция. Все же видят, что коррупция та же самая осталась, что и было раньше. Как будто бы говорят, что все борются с коррупцией, но никто этого не замечает. И все, которые там занимают это место, они, ну что они могут новое? А вот правый сектор это какая-то новая, так сказать, течия какая-то новая.
Мне кажется, просто нет больше никого, кто мог бы сейчас объединить людей.
Таку політику проводити, коли
Shaken by revolutions, exhausted by a war that shows no signs of abating, the Ukrainian state is weak. Against this backdrop, a radical right party with a well-armed military wing is gaining strength. History suggests that is a dangerous combination.
With smoke bombs and drums, some 3,000 members of Ukraine's nationalist Azov Battalion marched through the capital, Kyiv. In a show of force, they lit flares outside the parliament building. It was a warning to the government against making any potential deal that would lead to elections in separatist-controlled territory of eastern Ukraine. The Azov Battalion was formed in 2014 to fight Russia-backed separatists in Ukraine's east and is now part of the Interior Ministry's National Guard. They also called for Ukraine's borders to be fully restored. The battalion's leader vowed there would be more protests outside parliament if the government failed to heed their warnings.
Рій, наше гасло. України, діти, ми. Нехай Москва лежить в руїнах, а нам на це не чхати. Смерть, смерть москалям! Смерть, смерть москалям!
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hi Spike, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
So I'm looking through the documentary you shot for us in Ukraine. Basically, I just wanted to ask if you could take me through a few things. We're looking at these kids at camp, right? Like singing around a campfire?
This is a summer camp for children run by a military battalion on the outskirts of Kiev. Summer camps in Ukraine are common, but this one is much more extreme. The kids spend a week on the camp. They learn patriotic songs, they receive firearms combat training, and they participate in combat reconstructions. The children that you're seeing in this edit, half of them have a direct relationship to a battalion called Azov.
So who is Azov?
Azov are a controversial Ukrainian battalion. After Crimea's annexation, the official Ukrainian military didn't have enough soldiers to fight. So civilians formed many of their own volunteer battalions, one of which was Azov. Soon after, in November 2014, Azov were brought into the official National Guard. So now they're a legitimate battalion.
В дитинстві взагалі немає уявлення, що таке війна, мабуть, і не задумуєшся. Це зараз. То дітям треба казати, що в нас війна, щоб вони розуміли.
Моє рішення. Я цілий рік хотів цей табір. І мої мрії здійснилися.
He's incredible, Smokey. His memory of patriotic literature and poems was incredible. The kids live in tents, and sometimes they're woken up at 3 a.m. by fireworks or like smoke grenades, you know, and they have to get out of their tents and simulate combat. But if you ask any of them, they enjoy it.
These guys saw action, right? Who were they actually fighting against in that like archive footage?
They are fighting Russian sympathizers. It's not Russian army, it's Russian rebels, I suppose, or perhaps even Ukrainian-born Russian sympathizers.
Я не лівих взглядів, я не комуніст. Я не нацист, не фашист. Я націоналіст своєї країни.
I wanted to pick up on the nationalism thing. What do they identify as being a nationalist of Ukraine?
Number one is not to be Russian, because for the last 100 years, Russia have been oppressing and pushing at their borders. And number two is to hold on to whatever Ukrainian identity they did have and still do have. So they're sitting between Russia and Russia's ideologies, but also not wanting to join a liberalizing Western Europe.
Те ж саме ми хочемо привити до дітей, щоб вони любили Україну, щоб вони її не споплюжували. Покоління, яке зараз в нашій країні, воно повинно забезпечити фундамент для іншого покоління.
Быстрее, быстрее, быстрее! And did you get a sense that people like approve or don't approve of these camps?
The idea of the Azov camp specifically is less popular depending on who you speak to. The Ukrainian public offer them some gratitude for the work that they did in 2014 in terms of saving part of the east of Ukraine, but their ideologies are radical for the rest of Ukraine. They don't like immigration, they don't like foreigners.
К сожалению, мы находимся в состоянии необъявленной войны. Мы не учим своих детей отнимать жизни. Мы учим их культуре общения с оружием.
The fear that they're feeling, does that link to nationalism somehow?
Historically, how their nationalism relates to fear. It's fear of their language being squashed by Russia. It's fear of their land being taken away by Russia.
Is there an argument to be made that these camps kind of are stoking the fear or providing a solution?
I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? If the children didn't go to these camps, the children wouldn't have such a deep idea of Ukraine-Russian history. But then I guess if the war came closer, would they be hindered by that? I don't know. I'm sure the camps do propagate the fear, but whether or not it's necessary, I really don't know either.
Страх – це зло. Страх – це чорна смість, яка доводить людей до сказу.
For Ukrainian nationalists, January 1st is one of the most important days in their calendar. It marks the birth of Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian partisan forces during the Second World War. The rally was organized by the far-right Svoboda party. Protesters marched amidst a river of torches and signs saying, "Ukraine above all else." But for many in Ukraine and abroad, Bandera's legacy is controversial. His group, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, sided with Nazi German forces before breaking with them later in the war. Western historians also say that his followers carried out massacres of Polish and Jewish civilians. But for many of his supporters, he is a symbol of Ukraine's struggle for independence.
This year is the 105th anniversary of his birthday. Every year since 2006, Svoboda marches on the 1st of January in memory of him and to spread his ideas. The ideas are very simple: to leave it an independent country where Ukrainians will be the owners of their motherland.
The Svoboda party itself is also highly controversial. It has played a major role in the country's pro-European, anti-government protests, now more than a month old. Ukraine is a deeply divided country, however, and many in its east and south consider the party to be extremist. Many observers say that rallies like today's Torchlight March only add to this division.
This video has sent a shiver across Ukraine. The marching young men are far-right nationalists from the National Militia, or National Militia. They're at a sacred spot, Ukraine's crucible. Maidan, Independence Square in central Kiev. This was the Maidan in 2014, as hundreds of thousands of people rallied and ultimately forced out an unpopular president. Russia branded it a coup, orchestrated by neo-Nazis and fascists. It wasn't true then, but 4 years on, Ukraine's far right is on the march, and there appears little appetite for stopping it.
Are you from Kiev? Yes, I'm from Kiev, from this district.
The National Militia have permission to patrol unarmed on Ukraine's streets.
So what are we looking for, Alexander? В первую очередь полиция попросила нас проконтролировать точки кредитирования, на которые в последнее время на которых часто начали случаться разбои. Вот. И уже косвенно мы контролируем вообще ситуацию на улице, то есть пытаемся выявить какие-то правонарушения и среагировать.
It's pretty tame stuff. They spot a woman drinking alcohol near a kid's playground.
Либо допивайте сейчас, либо выбрасывайте. Ну.
Не, жалко, вы выбросите, деньги заплачены.
Или дома там допить, просто на детской площадке.
We then go to a place where punters can gamble on computer terminals.
Здравствуйте. Игра закончена.
We're told it's been operating illegally, as its owners allegedly have links to Russia. It's unspectacular stuff. The National Militia call the police out,
Незаконний гральний бізнес.
and reluctantly they appear and go through the motions. What the National Militia want us to film is that they're a force for good, here to restore order and make the police do their job.
К сожалению, полиция не справляется со всеми проблемами, которые существуют в нашей стране. Естественно, мы, как патриоты Украины, возлагаем эти функции на себя.
It's a message that has some resonance. There's a growing despondency here about how little has changed. The next day, we're contacted by the company that owns the gambling shop. It turns out that many of their other branches have also been raided by the National Militia.
Где-то около часа дня к нам забежали группа молодых людей, человек 20-25.
This is the National Militia when journalists aren't watching.
В масках, с молотками, с битами, в куртках с надписью «Национальная дружина». Они кричали «Слава Украине», еще там какие-то свои лозунги. Начали здесь все просто громить. Полная разруха. Все было побито абсолютно.
We're given other footage, which shows more places being trashed, men lighting fireworks indoors, even setting one location on fire. The National Militia tell us they're working alongside the police, but they have also, on several occasions, fought them. Here they brawled and used pepper spray on officers as they tried and failed to pressure a judge into keeping an allegedly corrupt politician in custody. The National Militia are part of a group called Azov. Initially a volunteer military battalion, it has well-established links to the far right. Its founder, this man 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗪𝗶, has in the past expressed racist and anti-Semitic views. And its logo has clear Nazi overtones.
My favorite quote from 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗪𝗶 is that the destiny of the Ukrainian nation is to be an avant-garde in holy war of white people against underhumans led by Semites.
𝗶𝗶𝗪𝗶 now denies he ever said that, but as this oath-making ceremony shows, he's not running away from the dubious imagery. Azov has now started a political party, as well as launching the National Militia. The toxic racism has, in public at least, been replaced by patriotic nationalism.
The National Militia have already been flexing their muscles in Ukrainian politics. This is the city hall in the town of 𝗥𝘂𝘀𝗃. Look at it now. All round the outside are security officers. There are more police here today than there are representatives.
And the reason the police have come is because at the last session, this happened. The National Militia, together with some war veterans, turned up and stood among the deputies, announcing that no one would leave until the mayor's budget was passed. After some scuffles and angry exchanges, the budget was passed.
Зараз Черкаси стали тренувальним майданчиком для військового перевороту в Україні.
Alarmist? Perhaps, but many people, not just in 𝗥𝘂𝘃, are wondering whether the National Militia are being mobilized as part of a bigger political play.
Без погодження МВД, то такого існувати в Україні не може. Якщо Аваков прийме рішення для себе, що таким чином національна дружина, яка вона є зараз, не може існувати, де люди ходять в балаклавах, де люди ходять у військовій формі, то я думаю, це питання буде рішено.
This is him, Arsen Avakov, Ukraine's ambitious interior minister. His links to the Azov group are well known. He's put their fighters on the payroll of his ministry and appointed one of their commanders, Vadim Troyan, as his deputy. The National Militia may well be the extreme right's first move ahead of Ukraine's elections next year. But it's the uncertainty over who's behind them that's worrying people. Confidence in politicians and the police here is low, and for whatever reason, the National Militia appear to have been given the nod to act outside the law.
Історія, вона повторюється, якщо ми подивимося, що відбувалося в Германії там 37-39 рік, да, коли воно фашизм тоді піднімався, то в принципі можна, я б їх цим самим зрівняв.
It's an apocalyptic warning, but it's a reminder that 4 years after Ukraine turned away from Russia towards Europe, the struggle for its soul is far from over.
It seemed like an odd way to spend a Saturday, watching the blood sports at a festival for far-right extremists. This was the summer of 2019, and I'd gone to Ukraine to learn more about these groups. From the crowds, one thing seemed pretty clear about them. They weren't bothered by the fact that this event was organized by the Azov movement, a far-right group that has increasingly been linked to violence around the world.
The shooter is linked to a 74-page manifesto filled with white supremacist rhetoric.
FBI agents say he expressed a desire to travel to Ukraine to fight with a far-right paramilitary group.
At least one member of an American hate group also trained in Ukraine, with Azov Battalion.
According to the FBI, domestic terrorists killed 39 people in fiscal year 2019, making it the most deadly year for domestic terrorism since the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing.
The threat of white nationalism has evolved since Oklahoma City, where a domestic terrorist used a truck bomb to kill at least 168 people. Police don't tend to see such terrorists as lone wolves acting in isolation anymore. It's become clear to law enforcement that these attackers often have links to a global network, one with common goals and a shared ideology.
We are looking very hard at white supremacists or neo-Nazis here, connecting through social media online with like-minded individuals overseas, and in some cases actually traveling overseas to train.
Over the last few years, experts in violent extremism have grown especially alarmed about the Azov movement. The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. The fighting in that region has become kind of ideal breeding ground for militias like Azov. At their public events, one thing that surprised me was how many Ukrainians tend to see Azov not as militants or extremists, but as war heroes. In Kyiv, the capital, I watched an Independence Day parade where veterans of the Azov Battalion marched alongside other volunteer militias, surrounded by cheering crowds, who thanked them for defending Ukraine against Russia. But even at the march, there were signs of the far-right ideology that's so common inside Azov. The symbols on their flags have been especially controversial. Azov says it combines the letters I and N for idea of nation, but extremism experts see it as an emblem of Nazism.
The official symbol of Azov, it's a version of 𝗲𝗏𝗪𝗏. It was one of the symbols of one of SS division during the World War II. It is one of more or less usual symbols for neo-Nazi groups all over the world.
And it's not just about their symbols. When it was founded in 2014, Azov drew many of its commanders and recruits from Ukraine's most notorious far-right groups, including outright neo-Nazis.
We basically recruited everyone who could hold weapons in their hand when Ukrainian state was paralyzed and the defense of Ukrainian state was totally in the hand of Ukrainian volunteers. So there were many war adventurers, guys who believed that they are on a kind of ideological tour to save maybe the future of the West and so on and so forth.
So the future of the white race?
Oh, yes, yes.
Azov's paramilitary wing is now a major fighting force, with its own bases and training grounds near the front lines of the war against pro-Russian forces. After the Veterans Parade in Kyiv, I interviewed 𝗲𝗏𝗿𝗶, who founded the Azov movement in 2014.
Воинское братство – это люди, которые не просто служили вместе, а вместе проливали кровь, переживали гибель товарищей, сладость побед, охраны общественного порядка на улице. Мы создаем отряды самообороны, которые помогают поддерживать порядок на улицах.
Azov's leaders have also tried to break into politics. They failed to win any seats in parliament during the most recent elections in 2019, but their plans in Ukraine are ambitious.
Сьогодні ми відпочиваємо, але навіть відпочиваючи, ми пропагуємо наші нові українські цінності. Бути сильними і сміливими, бути єдиними і відчувати братерство своєї нації.
What worries officials in the West is Azov's recruitment strategy. It's tried hard to build friendships with far-right groups around the world, especially in the US and Europe. During my visit in 2019, I spent a day at one of the biggest recruitment events in Azov's history. Thousands of people showed up for a day of fighting sports and blatant propaganda. There were neo-Nazi symbols, tattoos, and posters all over the place. And many in the crowd seemed pretty receptive to Azov's far-right ideology.
Бути толерантним про-ЛГБТшникам – це неприродне. Для цього треба людині промити мозки. Поважати своїх батьків, любити своїх дітей, пишатися за свою країну – це нормально.
Events like this also tend to attract recruits from abroad. One of the ones I met was named Robin, who had just arrived in Ukraine from Sweden, where he told me he's wanted for hate crimes.
This is so hard to explain the surroundings for someone who's watching this, you know. It's surreal. It's like, I don't know, it's like something you read about the great Germany before, you know, in the 1920s. It's a revival of the Indo-European soul. And it's all happening here in Ukraine.
Afterward, we rode back to the Azov base in northern Kyiv, where Azov commanders had allowed Robin to stay as a potential recruit.
We are Aryans, and we will rise again. That's a way of life, you know. And after the war in Germany, we went back to the benches, school benches, but now we will rise again.
Robin, the Swede I met at that festival, wrote me that he was going to the front lines to join the fight. With recruits like this, it's little wonder that US officials see Azov as a threat. Experts point out that the pace of white supremacist terrorism has intensified, with new incidents frequently filling the headlines. 22 gunned down at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, 2 killed near a synagogue in Halle, Germany, 9 more in an attack on 2 shisha bars near Frankfurt, and a series of arrests exposing far-right terror plots across the US and Europe. One tally reported an increase of 320% in such attacks in Western countries between 2014 and 2019.
Я знаю, я вірю, я переконаний, що ми готові до боротьби, що ми готові бути сміливими і сильними, що ми готові перемагати. Бо за нами Україна, а перед нами наша остаточна велика перемога. Слава Україні! Героям слава! Слава нації! Смерть ворогам!
Стільки зброї не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу, тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, вау, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс, про який зараз говорять там Туреччина, Польща, Британія, Україна. Тут ми тут флагман, тому що ми затіяли війну, якої не було вже останніх 60 років. Так от, уявіть собі, скільки в нас зброї, скільки в нас ветеранів. А тепер уявіть, зникає Росія, вона розвалюється. Тобто виникає там 5 Росій, там ні до Росії і так далі. На європейському континенті найбільше, тільки в Британії там, здається, більше. Ви розумієте, цей потенціал цих збройних сил, це стане проблемою зразу для всіх, хто зараз нам десь там намагається робити хенькі уколи. І оце от є наша радість і наша печаль. Чому, щоб ви розуміли, чому так все важко? Не тому, що ми, українці, 300 років, наша дупа страждала, чому ж нарешті влада до нас не впаде, ми такі хороші, ми хочемо в Європу. Ні, це величезна, потужна держава, і якщо ми тут прийдемо до влади, це буде і радість, і проблеми для всього світу. Тому це величезна, амбітна задача. Ми живемо дуже в класний час, і тому перед нами стоять надзвичайно амбітна, класна ціль. Не просто стати там частинкою європейської сім'ї, яка вже там розвалилася, а це є, вже йдеться про те, що нові політичні альянси вже глобального рівня, нові політичні виклики. Націоналістичні ідеї. Націоналісти якби були там ключовим фактором однозначно і на фронті. Зараз дуже багато є спекуляцій. Ну, нацика вже ж було небагато, там, ну, ЛГБТшники, там, посольства кажуть, ну, скільки там було там нациків? Ну, нациків там було там 10%, там, ну, запаяних, ідейних. Ну, це ж питання в тому, це може так казати лише Йов, який не був на війні, не знає, наскільки оцих от 10%, хоча там навіть може дуже менше було, я думаю, націоналістів було хай там навіть 8%, ну, наскільки це в пропорції ефективності впливу, наскільки це складало просто галопуючи безкінечну підвищення ефективності. Не було б цих 8%, бо ефективність упала б на 90%. То тут не в числі мова. Так само, як на Майдані. Зараз вже почали ліваки, там, фонди Бьоля, там, і так далі перераховувати. Ну, націоналістів там було, там, да, вони були впливові. Там. Та які впливові? Не було б націоналістів, все би це от пішло би сразу на гей-парад.
Once again, Moscow putting forward things like they went in to de-Nazify Ukraine whose president is a Jew.
Yeah. Well, if you tell a lie big enough and you keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. It's not my quote. Wish I had said that. Not my quote. It was Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Nazi propaganda chief. I will repeat it. If you tell a lie big enough and you keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. That is clearly the case with a large part of the Russian population who would agree with 100% of what they heard today is the written gospel for them, because they've had it drilled into their heads by Russia's heavily censored state-controlled media. It is a line propagated by Putin and his inner circle, and no one is perhaps more closely attached at the hip, if you will, to Putin than Sergey Lavrov, who has been his stalwart foreign minister for the past 20 years, 20-plus years of Putin's reign. And what's interesting about it, when you hear him talking about the things you were saying, denazification. Let's go through the terms quickly. We've talked about it a million times, right? Right, this is about denazifying Ukraine. Ukraine with a Jewish president who lost family members in the Holocaust. So put that aside. What is that about? Denazification is a coded historical term. Yes, the Soviets talked about denazifying literally during World War II. Maybe they had some moral high ground there when they were fighting Nazi Germany. Today, denazification has much more darker, sinister undertones when it's used in the sort of Orwellian newspeak that is the common language of Putin and his inner circle. Denazification really is about toppling, if you will, replacing in whatever way you can the pro-Western, the Western-leaning, the U.S.-leaning, the Europe-leaning leadership of Ukraine, in this case Zelensky and his top officials, replacing them, maybe assassinating them, maybe killing them, who knows, replacing them with puppet figures who will be presumably more friendly to Moscow, a puppet regime in the classic full sense of the term. Demilitarization. What is that about when you're talking about a country with an army that is a fraction, when I say a fraction, a tenth or less the size of Russia's very mighty military, which has been modernized, to the tune of $450 billion of military spending a year now by President Putin. Modernized, Ukraine's army and forces, no matter how valiant and resilient they are, in military terms, they are a pipsqueak compared to Russia. So when you're talking about demilitarization of a country a tenth the size of your military forces posing an existential threat to your own, what is that? That's code term for basically wanting to get rid of Ukraine's sovereignty. Make sure that there is nothing in Ukraine that has any way, shape, or form the mission of trying to ensure that that sovereignty, 30 years long sovereignty, is safeguarded. The most interesting thing here, beyond the terms, and genocide, of course, using the genocide, we have heard this drilled into Soviet propaganda, the Soviet-Russian propaganda over the past 8 years, that there is a genocide, literally a genocide. We know what genocides are, right? The mass extermination of a people being basically perpetrated against ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, Russian citizens in Ukraine, a lot of them in the Donbass especially have been given Russian passports. It's hogwash. It is reality detached.
It's hogwash. It is reality detached.
Что демилитаризация, украинская экономика, мы бы хотели это все обсудить и формализировать, чтобы потом не было как у Петра Алексеевича.
Если ты со мной хочешь формализировать отношения?
В меморандуме.
Я с тобой?
Не я с вами, а все люди, которые в этом процессе, те, которым болит за Украину.
Капитуляция, прошу так.
Формализация.
Я пришел, тебе сказал, вы оружие вывезете, а ты меня переводишь стрелки.
Так я вам второй момент уже озвучил. Я вас услышал, вы сказали.
Ты мне вообще не можешь никакие ультиматумы озвучивать, Денис, ты не понял.
Так я вам ультиматум, я говорю, это были люди.
Нам за эти оружие забрать?
При чем здесь? Я вам говорю за второй момент.
Я не понимаю, чем мы закончим сейчас разговор.
Так мы нормально общаемся.
Ну так и давай нормально общаться.
Ну, никто же вас не пытается макнуть
никуда.
Вам передали то, что происходило в Украине, то, что люди еще
мне передал? Я же тебе говорю, ты мне скажи,
так я вам говорю, по Украине были акции.
Денис, по Украине вчера прошел дождь, вот что я слышу.
Ну, так я вам рассказываю о том, что происходило.
Где акции? Кто мне что передал? Говорю, давай, что ты...
Вот я вам и говорю, что люди хотят встречи с вами.
Какие люди? Нет,
которые вышли на мероприятие под...
Фамилию ты можешь мне сказать или нет? Ты что ты в самом время...
хотите, Плеханов, Кухарчук, это по разным областям.
Денис, это же так не делается.
Так спросили, я
подожди, вышел Стадник вам, Николай Вечеров.
Наш губернатор.
Передал письмо. Да, или что вы ему там... Вернее, вы ему передали.
Конечно, для президента.
Ну, он мне передаст, я прочитаю.
Так вы же спросили, что там было. Я вам и рассказываю, что, собственно, в этом письме. Вы же сами спросили только что.
Послушай, я президент этой страны.
Конечно.
Мне 42 год. Я ж не лох. Я тебе пришел и сказал, оружие уберите. А ты меня не переводи на акции.
Причем мы с вами уже поговорили, вы потом
я
спросили
не поговорил
за
с тобой, я хотел увидеть в глазах понимание.
Ну.
А увидел парня, который решил, что перед ним какой-то лопух стоит, и переводишь меня на другую тему.
Так какая другая тема? Мы уже этот момент обсудили, я вам следующим сказал еще один
я
момент.
услышал,
можно?
что окей, ты мне скажи ок, все.
Ну так у нас нет оружия в руках. Ну,
это значит, ты меня не услышишь.
Ну слушайте.
Парни, это я вам сейчас сказал серьезно.